Hi. I hope you can chew and listen at two things at once, and we'll just get started so that we don't run late. I'm Delinda Hanley, the moderator of this panel, and this panel is the lobby good for Israel? So I'm the news editor and executive director of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, co-founded 33 years ago by Ambassador Andrew Kilgore, who is sitting right there. Would you stand up for a moment, please? Okay, well. And my father, Richard Curtis, and my mother is sitting that way. Our previous panelists talked about the Israel lobby's effect on political discourse in the United States. This panel will grapple with the question, is the lobby good for Israel? So Miko Pellet is going to talk about how the lobby enables Israeli policy. And he's an Israeli living in America. Miko Pellet is an Israeli writer and an activist living in the US. He was born and raised in Jerusalem, driven by personal family tragedy to explore Palestine, its people, and its narrative. He has written a really good book about his journey called The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, and he'll have a book signing outside. All these speakers who have spoken, who have books, are having signings that are on the back of your schedule. Their book, you will have quite a collection of books if you buy these. So the book describes Pellet's family's history since his grandparents immigrated to Palestine in the early 20th century. His maternal grandfather was a signer of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. His father, Mati, was a general in the Israeli army. Check out Miko's blog, Tear Down the Wall, at mikopeled.com. And please come, and we can't wait to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. It's a real honor to speak here and to be with all you, these wonderful people here, to be on this excellent panel with Gidon and Hoida, I believe, is coming too. I see that Congressman Paul Findley joined us, so it's nice to see you, Congressman, once again. Yeah, let's give him a hand. And many friends and other activists and people who are really crucial to the issue of Palestine and to the understanding of the issue of Palestine. Of course, the Washington Report that's been vital in providing real-time, real information about this issue. So the question that was posed to me, is the lobby good for Israel? And my reply would be, or I would answer this with an unequivocal yes. Those of you who have read their book, Mersheimer and Walt, argue that no lobby has managed to divert U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy, as far from what American national interest would otherwise suggest, while simultaneously convincing Americans that U.S. and Israeli interests are essentially identical. They continue to say AIPAC's success is due to its ability to reward legislators and congressional candidates who support its agenda and to punish those who challenge it. AIPAC makes sure that its friends get strong financial support from the myriad pro-Israeli PACs. Those seen as hostile to Israel, on the other hand, can be sure that AIPAC will direct campaign contributions to their opponents. The bottom line is that AIPAC, which is a de facto agent of a foreign government, has a stranglehold on the U.S. Congress. Open debate about U.S. policy towards Israel does not occur there, even though that policy has important consequences for the entire world. One could really end the discussion here, probably, with that statement on its own, but I think this issue deserves a lengthier discussion. I think that AIPAC and the State of Israel, which benefits from AIPAC's work, owe much of its success to its predecessors, a group of Zionist diplomats who began as early as the turn of the last century, and by the 1920s were already traveling extensively around the world, lobbying for the Zionist project and for the funding and implementation of the project, basically the project being the colonization of Palestine by European Jews. Without the huge efforts and diplomatic talent of these people, who included Chaim Weizmann, Moshe Sharet, my own grandfather, Avram Katznelson, later on Abba Eban and Golda Meir, to name but a few, without these people and their work, Zionism could not have enjoyed the success it had in the years leading up to the Zionist occupation of Palestine and the establishment of the State of Israel. The lobbying by the early Zionist diplomats, all of whom, by the way, were well-spoken, highly educated, completely secular, they were all white Europeans and looked nothing like traditional Jews that the world was accustomed to seeing. Their work paved the way to AIPAC and its tentacles here in the US and in other countries in the West where Zionists needed support. In order to appreciate AIPAC's enormous contribution to Israel, I think we need to do two things. We need to understand what this organization is ultimately selling and understand its strategy. The key to Israel's legitimacy is the Zionist narrative. And AIPAC is selling the narrative in order to maintain the legitimacy. The Zionist narrative in this country is not only accepted, it is treated with religious fervor. It is seen as biblical and indisputable. One does not need to convince Americans that Israel is always right and that the Zionist narrative is true, because they receive this with their mother's milk, quite literally. And what is this narrative? It is a mythical story that turned the history of Palestine from 1947 until the present time on its head. The brutal ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the establishment of a racist apartheid state, which offers exclusive rights to Jewish people in Palestine, was sold here as a story of heroism and revival. Thanks to AIPAC, the horrific, brutal destruction of Palestine from 1947 to the present day is virtually unknown in this country. That in itself is an impressive accomplishment without which Israel could not have survived. And there is no better proof of that success than the reaction here in the US to the 51-day massacre of innocents in Gaza that took place in the summer of 2014. More than 2,000 people were murdered in cold blood in Gaza on prime time. Yet we may safely say that there was a consensus in this country that this massacre was not only acceptable and justifiable, but necessary as a means of self-defense. To achieve this is nothing short of magic, and AIPAC was able to pull this through. When Israel, through AIPAC and the countless organizations that work with it and through it, talks about a threat to Israeli security, they mean a threat to the narrative. Since the early 1950s, Israel has been claiming that Palestinians in the Gaza Strip pose a threat to its security, indeed, to its very existence. The Israeli army has been attacking in Gaza and exacting a heavy toll on civilians in Gaza for nearly 7 decades. Yet, surprisingly, there has never been a tank, a fighter jet, or a regular military remotely capable of threatening the state of Israel. Why then do we hear so much about a security threat when now, as in the past, the Gaza Strip is made up of mostly poor refugees? It is the narrative. The existence of over 1 million refugees in Gaza, the majority of whom are under 18 years of age, is a threat to the narrative and therefore a threat to the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And therein lies the threat to Israeli existence. AIPAC has been able to successfully sell the myth of the existential threat to the American public. We constantly hear about the threats to Israeli existence, though clearly there has never been one. The threat of Gaza, the threat of Palestinians everywhere, the threat of Iraq, the threat of Iran, the threat of SJP, as we heard earlier, are all fabricated in order to allow Israel to maintain its brutal hold on Palestine and its people, and to receive foreign aid, though clearly, as a developed state, it does not need and should not qualify for it. The myth of Israel as a democracy has no factual basis, yet it too has become an indisputable fact. Israel has from the very beginning defined itself as a racist apartheid state that prefers Jews. No attempt has been made to hide this fact, And for almost 7 decades, Israeli lawmakers have made it their business to develop the state for the Jewish population at the expense of the Palestinian population, be they citizens, residents, or simply people living without any legal definition at all. Palestinians have been pushed out of every aspect of the life of the state from the very beginning, not to mention the fact that they were pushed out of the country and not allowed to return. The web of laws that govern the lives of Palestinians, whether they live in Jaffa, in Haifa, in Jerusalem, in the Negev Desert, in Ramallah, Jenin, or in Khan Yunis, is too complicated to even attempt to understand. Yet regardless of where in Palestine Palestinians reside, they are governed by the State of Israel under laws that are vastly different than the ones that govern the lives of Jewish Israelis. And still we hear that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Israeli occupation of the West Bank, which took place in June of 1967, is sold as though it was the result of an inevitable war, a response to an existential threat, at the end of which Israelis prevailed, and the territories are the spoils of war. But in fact, the conquest of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip were the final stage of the occupation of Palestine, and all were planned far in advance. The War of 1967 concluded and completed the occupation of Palestine and the creation of a single state over all of Palestine with exclusive rights for Jewish people. What is Jewish about this, as Alice Rothschild asked earlier, I don't know. Most Jewish people don't live there. The majority of the people who do live there are not Jewish, and Israel certainly does not espouse any Jewish values. Yet, we hear that Israel is the Jewish state. None of this could have been achieved without a strong and influential lobby. AIPAC is engaged in convincing Americans that U.S. and Israeli interests are essentially identical, as I mentioned earlier. But there is no need to convince Americans that Israel is right because, like I said earlier, they receive it with their mother's milk. So much so that in cases where the interests of the two countries collide, the demand is always for the U.S. to adjust its policy so as to align with Israeli interests and not the other way around. And we saw this example recently, about a month ago, with Netanyahu's very successful campaign stop here at the Capitol and with the Iran issue. One has to wonder, how is it that a false history is kept alive in the face of clear evidence to its being untrue? Well, you can imagine my surprise when I looked at my son's high school history book. My boys went to school in San Diego, an AP World History book, and found that the entire chapter regarding the ancient Hebrews is taken from the Old Testament. My first reaction was to make sure I was actually looking at a history book. The second reaction was to see if the beginning of the book begins with the story of creation, of the creation, basically teaching creationism, because they may as well have been. In a country where there is a debate still over whether creationism should be taught in school or evolution, the Zionist narrative, which claims its roots in biblical stories of the ancient Hebrews, is taught as history, although little to no historical proof exists to substantiate it. This sort of influence can only be achieved through years and years of hard work, an effort to instill the narrative as a value and not just as an historical episode. This can only be done, again, by a lobby that knows how to influence society. Along this vein, AIPAC and the other Zionist groups, all of whom are in the business of selling the Zionist narrative, engage in community development and service activities that root them well in communities across the country. Validation and acceptance of the Zionist narrative are an integral part of almost all of these efforts, as well as the delegitimization of any Palestinian claims to a legitimate narrative which contradicts the Zionist story. The Zionist narrative is a value that goes hand in hand with democracy, freedom, and tolerance, while the Palestinian narrative is associated with lies, hatred, violence, and bigotry. Today we see serious cracks in the wall that AIPAC was able to build around the issue of Palestine. It has been severely weakened due to the diligence and tremendous work being done, like we heard earlier, on campuses by Students for Justice in Palestine. For the first time, we see a change in the conversation on Palestine, and the level of the debate on this issue has been elevated, again, thanks to SJP. So it would seem that the big bad lobby, AIPAC, has now finally met its match with Students for Justice in Palestine on campuses. But still, we see plenty of tolerance workshops and initiatives to weed out racism and anti-Semitism, and this was done recently at UCLA, where one of my sons is a junior. And these take place in schools and universities all across the US. And within these seemingly benign and positive initiatives, the Zionist narrative and the delegitimization of Palestinians are pursued with vigilance. The persecution of Palestinians in the US, which is a crucial element in the survival of the Zionist narrative and the legitimacy of Israel, is also the work of a well-oiled lobby. Nothing, I believe, demonstrates this better than the closure, prosecution, trial, and convictions of the Holy Land Foundation and the 5 men who operated it. This could not have been achieved without tremendous behind-the-scenes work and years of preparation. It was one of the clearest cases of injustice in the history of the American judicial system, and it has the Israeli lobby fingerprints all over it. The Holy Land Foundation did not engage in terrorist activities, nor did they fund or support terrorism in any way. This was made absolutely clear in their trials. Yet 5 men were convicted and are currently serving prison sentences of 20 to 65 years in maximum security jails. Why was this necessary? Because a respected, successful, and honest Muslim Palestinian charity is a threat to the narrative and to the legitimacy of the State of Israel. So the Holy Land Foundation, its operators, its major contributors, and an entire community had to be taken down. And though it took almost 2 decades and 2 trials, this mission was accomplished. AIPAC's success is due to its ability to reward legislators and congressional candidates who support its agenda and to punish those who challenge it. It starts, in fact, at a much lower level. Members of small and seemingly insignificant city councils, as well as large ones, are invited to junkets, as we all know, to see Israel. Connections to AIPAC are developed very early in a politician's career so that every aspiring politician in the US understands that supporting Israel, even if it means turning a blind eye to terrible crimes, even if it means giving Netanyahu, who stands at the head of a racist, brutal regime, and who oversaw the cold-blooded murder of thousands of civilians in Gaza just a few months ago, again, even if it means receiving him with a standing ovation, it is necessary for success in American politics. Maintaining Israeli legitimacy and keeping the narrative alive is key. It is the most important strategic objective for Israel, and therefore it is so for AIPAC. We can clearly say that AIPAC is and always has been not only good, but crucial to the existence of the State of Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I just wonder if Israel is so good, if the lobby is so good for Israel, they're losing wonderful Israelis like you. You're living in California. They're moving to Berlin. What's the deal here? Anyway, Gideon Levy. He is going to talk about unconditional support for Israel. Does it endanger Israeli voices? As we all know, Gideon Levy is a columnist for the Israeli daily Haaretz and a member of its editorial board. Levy joined Haaretz in 1982 and spent 4 years as the newspaper's deputy editor. He's the author of the weekly Twilight Zone feature, which covers the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza over the last 25 years, as well as a writer of political editorials for the newspaper. Our Washington Report readers love it when we reprint his powerful columns in our pages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that Miko left me 2 spare minutes, so I'll be longer. Thank you very much for having me here today. Never was I so convinced that Israel and the United States are really sharing the same values after listening to all those fascinating presentations today, because by the end of the day, we are dealing with two regimes which are very, very similar, with two regimes that have very little to do with democracy, and I will get to it. I was born in Tel Aviv. I was brought up in Tel Aviv. I was a very good boy in Tel Aviv. I served in the Israeli army. I did even something which is much worse than this. I worked for 4 years with Shimon Peres, then leader of Israeli opposition in the late 70s, early 80s, before most of you were born. And it was only by the late 80s when I started to travel to the occupied territories quite accidentally, when I realized, as a journalist, when I realized that the biggest drama of Israel is taking place half an hour away from our homes, in our dark backyard, that this real drama of Israel has almost no one to be interested in, that it is hidden in the backyard of Israel, half an hour away from our homes. All those crimes are taking place, and we Israelis, most of us, if not all of us, do not want to know, do not know, and above all, do not care. And it took me many, many years to understand how come. How come that a society, some of you met Israelis, they are not monsters. Every catastrophe in the world, the Israelis are always the first one to send rescue teams with field hospitals. Many Israelis would help any old lady to cross the road many times, even if she doesn't want to cross the road. People with values. How come that this society lives for so many years with this drama in its backyard and feels so good about itself and has so little moral doubts, if at all? How is it possible? How is it possible that most of the Israelis, if not all of them, are deeply convinced that the IDF is the most moral army in the world? Try to tell an Israeli, and I tried it once or twice, you know what, maybe it's the second moral army in the world. Maybe the army of Luxembourg is more moral. I don't know if Luxembourg has an army at all. They will be deeply offended. How can you dare? How come that when this reality is taking place so close to our homes, not over the oceans, but just half an hour away from our homes, how come that we live in peace with it, that we continue with it, that there is no resistance, almost nothing? And here I want to object to what my friend Miko said. When I got first the invitation to come here, the first words were Israel lobby. I said, wow, they invite me. AIPAC is inviting me. And then I said, that's the chance of my life. And I'm going to come there to Washington and to tell them, listen, with friends like yours, Israel does not need enemies. But unfortunately, but then I continued to read, and I read that I'm privileged to be invited to another forum, not exactly AIPAC, and even not the Anti-Defamation League. But I can say it from here, Miko. I think that we are dealing with a corrupting friendship. I think that if it wouldn't be the Israel lobby, Israel would have been today a better place to live in. Israel would have been a more just place. And I think that if it wouldn't be the Israel lobby, the United States would have been a better place and a more democratic place. But it's not for me to judge the American politics. And still, by the end of the day, we are dealing with an enigma. because nothing can really explain it. Nothing can explain how administration after administration, legislators after legislators, are going in the very same way, which contradicts American interest in so many cases, which contradicts international law, human rights, moral values, you name it. Can it be only this small group, as powerful as it is? Is it the full explanation? I doubt it, but that's for you to decide, not for us in Israel. But for us in Israel, or at least for me, it is very clear. Think about a relative of yours or a friend of yours who is, God forbid, a drug addict. There are two ways to deal with him. One is to supply him with money and he will go and buy more drugs. He will be very grateful to you. He will appreciate you. He will tell you, you love me, you are my friend, you are my best friend. The other way is to send him to a rehabilitation center. He will be so mad at you. But what is real care? And what is real love? And what is real friendship? And does anyone in this hall have the slightest doubt that Israel is occupation addicted? But, and therefore for me, this conference here is so crucial and so important, because we have to face reality. And reality is that there is no chance for a change from within the Israeli society. No way. I'll try to explain why. But if this is the case, the only hope is for an international intervention. And the only hope is from this place, from Washington, from the United States, from the EU, only from there. Because the Israeli society is by far today too brainwashed. Life in Israel is by far too good. And Israel, let's face it, is a society which lives in denial, totally disconnected with reality. Would it be a private person? I would recommend either medications or hospitalization, because people who lose connection with reality might be very dangerous, either to themselves or to society. And the Israeli society lost connection with reality. It lost connection with the reality in its backyard. It's totally lost connection with the international environment. Really to believe that 5 million Jews know better than 6 billion people of the world? Really believe that 5 million Jews will be able to continue to live on their sword forever? Is there one example in history in which any country lived on its sword forever? Empires? Really believing that in the 21st century it is acceptable to ignore the international law in such a way, to ignore the international institutions, and to rely only on the United States and Micronesia. Let's not forget this friend of Israel. And recently also Czech Republic. Thank you, Czech Republic. And Canada, your neighbor, obviously. Does it work? Had it ever worked? So therefore it is so crucial for people like me to see any kind of change here in the United States. And we jump on any sign. When J Street was established, we say, yeah, here it comes. And it didn't come. When Obama was elected, I had tears in my eyes. I said, here it comes. And it didn't come. And when I see conferences like here today, again, it gives me some hope that change might happen. Because change will have to take place here. In Israel, it's a lost case. Forget about it. The Israeli society had surrounded itself with shields, with walls, not only physical walls, but also mental walls. I don't want to get into it because it's another lecture, but I'll just give the 3 principles which enable us Israelis to live so easily with this brutal reality. A, most of the Israelis, if not all of them, deeply believe that we are the chosen people. And if we are the chosen people, we have the right to do whatever we want. B, there were more brutal occupations in history. There were even longer occupations in history, even though the Israeli occupation gets to quite a nice record. But there was never in history an occupation in which the occupier presented himself as the victim. Not only the victim, the only victim around. This also enables any Israeli to live in peace because we are the victims. The other day, Professor Falk spoke about this dual strategy of Israel of being a victim on one hand and manipulating on the other hand. After what happened in Paris and in Copenhagen with the terror attacks, Benjamin Netanyahu came with the notion all the Jews must come to Israel. It's the safest place for the Jews in the world. It's a shelter for the Jews in the world. Which is wrong, because Israel is today the most dangerous place on earth for Jews, but let's put it aside. It was only 24 hours later when he said Israel is an existential threat under the Iranian bomb. And I asked myself, how can you dare call Jews to come and to join this suicidal project when the Iranians are going to bomb us? But in Israel, everything goes, and both declarations were accepted as the only truth. And here I get to the 3rd set of values which enable us Israelis to live in peace with the occupation. And this is maybe the most crucial one and the worst one. We say victimization, we say chosen people. When I say victimization, it goes without saying we have to mention the Holocaust and the unforgettable Mrs. Golda Meir that the American jury had exported to Israel. She said once, this unforgettable woman, that after the Holocaust, the Jews have the right to do whatever they want. But the 3rd set of values is the most dangerous one, and this is the systematic dehumanization of the Palestinians, which enable us Israelis to live in peace with everything, because if they are not human beings like us, then there is not really a question of human rights. And if you scratch under the skin of almost every Israeli, you will find it there. Almost no one will treat the Palestinians as equal human beings like us. I once wrote that we treat the Palestinians like animals, and I got so many protest letters from animal rights organizations. Rightly so. But by the end of the day, how many Israelis did ever try for a moment to put themselves in the place of the Palestinians for a moment, for one day? And I want to give you 2 examples which will demonstrate it. Many years ago, I interviewed then candidate for Prime Minister, Ehud Barak. And I asked him a question which I try to ask in any occasion. Mr. Barak, what would have happened if you would have been born Palestinian? And Barak gave me then the only honest answer he could give me. He said I would have joined a terror organization. What else would have he done? Would he become a poet? He doesn't know to write poems. Would he become a pianist? He's quite a bad pianist, and I doubt if he would have become a collaborator, because he is a fighter. And it became a scandal, because how can you dare to put Ehud Barak to think what would have happened if he would have become a Palestinian? And the second incident, briefly, Second Intifada, the city of Jenin, the most closed city in the West Bank, real total siege. I go out from Jenin, I come to the checkpoint, a Palestinian ambulance is parking there with the red lights. I stand after him. No cars can get out of Jenin in those days. No cars can get in. And I wait. The soldiers are playing backgammon in the tent. Usually I know myself. It's better that I don't get into a confrontation with the soldiers because it always ends up very badly. So I stayed in the car. But after 40 minutes, I couldn't take it. And I went out to the car, from the car. I went first to the Palestinian ambulance driver and I asked him, what's going on? He told me that's the routine. They let me wait 1 hour until they come and check the ambulance. And I couldn't take it anymore. And I went to the soldiers. It became a confrontation. But the question that I asked them, which really brought them to direct their weapons toward me, was one. What would have happened if your father would have been lying in this ambulance? This freaked them out. They lost control. How can I dare to compare between their father and the Palestinian in the ambulance? And this set of beliefs that they are not human beings like us enable us, Israelis, to live in so much peace with those crimes, ongoing crime for so many years, with losing any kind of humanity, values. I heard today people talk about Jewish values. I must be frank with you, I don't know what are Jewish values. I know what are universal values. Let's not get into it, really. There are very clear universal values. And there is a very, very clear international law. But for most of the Israelis, international law is very important. But not for Israel. Israel is a special case. Why is it a special case? And again, you get with all those set of values, with this living in denial. And here I want to get back to the topic of our panel. Is it good for Israel? No, it's very corrupting. Because as long as the United States enable Israel to continue, obviously the Palestinians are the first and direct, unbelievable victim of it. But by the end of the day, what will Israel be after all those years? What is it already today? Where does it direct to? And things are getting worse and worse. And therefore I have so little hope about change from within the Israeli society. Because things, as you might know, are going more and more to the nationalistic, militaristic, religious direction, with very little hope that change will come from within. Why would Israelis go for a change? What incentive? Why would they bother? Life is so good. You should have seen Israel in the days when Gaza was bombed, when the beaches were crowded, the helicopters were passing on their way to bomb Gaza. The Israeli TV hardly showed photos from there. Newspapers hardly wrote anything. I wrote one article about the responsibility of the pilots, and I needed to use bodyguards to get out of my home after this. The problem was, by the way, that the bodyguards were settlers, and they argued with me all day long until I saw that I'm much more secure without the bodyguards rather than with them. But the last war in Gaza, and this will be my final remarks, the last war in Gaza taught us also that Israel, which has 3 regimes today, maybe the only country, the only state in the world with 3 regimes, one for the Jews, one for the Arab citizens, and an apartheid regime in the West Bank and Gaza, one of the most brutal and cruel tyrannies in the world. But even for the facade, even for this democracy, which I always thought is a democracy for its Jewish citizens, I realized last summer that it is a democracy for its Jewish citizens, but only if they think like the majority. And therefore, and by this I want to conclude, I want to tell you all that few of us, very few, much too few, but few of us are looking to the West, Europe, and then United States, with a great hope because we lost hope in Israel. Thank you very much.
Well, now I'm afraid we're going to need a bodyguard to help you leave Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for your remarks. And I hear Huwaida, or her entourage. Huwaida Araf is going to talk about the situation of Arab citizens of Israel. Huwaida is a Palestinian-American lawyer and human rights advocate. And as the daughter of an Israeli-born Palestinian, she's also a citizen of Israel. In 2001, Araf co-founded the International Solidarity Movement, which has twice been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She was one of the organizers of a delegation of American lawyers to Gaza in February 2009, and she co-authored the report on their findings. She's a former chairperson of the Free Gaza movement and led 5 successful sea voyages to the Gaza Strip to challenge Israel's illegal blockade. She was one of the primary organizers of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, too. Please welcome Huwaida, and be writing some questions for these speakers. You don't have the opportunity to ask these questions. Do you want?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, good. You're used to being a mom.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to be with you today, and especially on such a distinguished panel. I was asked to speak about the situation of, well, actually, the title of the talk was The View of an Arab Citizen of Israel. And in order to give you that view, I think I need to start off by saying that I don't use that term, Arab citizen of Israel or Arab Israeli or Israeli Arab. I use the term Palestinian citizen of Israel, not even Palestinian Israeli. And this is not to negate my Arabness at all. Palestinians and Palestine is a very, very proud part of the Arab world. But it is because it is an assertion of my national identity. And a national identity that Israel has been trying to eradicate systematically for decades. And for a while, Palestinians inside Israel actually went along with it. After 1948, the thought was we will try to assimilate as best as possible, keep our heads down. But that is no longer. And I should note when saying this, saying that identifying myself as a Palestinian citizen of Israel as a way of asserting a national identity, you might ask, well, what about Israeli nationality? Actually, the Israeli Supreme Court, I don't know if many of you know, but ruled that Israeli is not a national identity because Israel considers itself the state of the Jewish people instead of being the state of its citizens. And this allows for the systematic discrimination of anybody that is not Jewish. And the previous panelists talked a lot about this, so I won't go into it as much except to tell you some personal experiences. Before that, I need to also assert that Palestinians inside Israel, many of you probably know, we are the remnants of the Palestinian people who survived the ethnic cleansing of 1948. And after that, after most Palestinian Christians and Muslims were kicked out of Palestine or killed, Israel, we did not relinquish our national identity. Israel changed our political status against our will and made us a minority in our own country. And that is how we remain, and people inside continue to fight for basic rights up against this institution that defines itself as existing for the Jewish people, and therefore, no matter what, in that political system, we cannot be equals. I am also an American citizen, and it pains me or annoys me to no end to repeatedly hear about how we Americans and Israelis share the same values. Now, since Israel's last election, we heard the White House actually express its, quote, deep concern over the video that surfaced of Netanyahu talking about or fear-mongering about how Arabs are coming out to vote in droves. And while that was a positive recognition and first step, it did not go far enough. And it was also couched in quite problematic language. Because in an interview, Obama said, she has a problem with it too. Obama said, although Israel was founded based on the historic Jewish homeland and the need to have a Jewish homeland, Israeli democracy has been premised on everybody in the country being treated equally and fairly, and there can be nothing further from the truth. Because since 1948, we have been discriminated against in all facets of life. People tell me, but you are a citizen and you can vote and you can travel freely. Yes, I'm a citizen. And yes, I can vote. And yes, I can leave from Ben Gurion Airport, whereas Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza cannot do that. Some of us, though, a lot of us have to go through extra Israeli security because we stand up for or oppose Israel's policies. And so while I can travel through Ben Gurion Airport, I am always pulled aside, and it takes quite a long time till they searched every nick and cranny of everything that I'm carrying and everything that is on me. Whereas Jewish Israelis or Jews coming from anywhere in the world don't have to go through that. But also the little things, I think, not so little, but things that you might not hear about. My grandfather passed away fighting to keep his land. We come from a small village in the Galilee, a village that is now about half its size. My grandfather was the largest landowner and Israel in that village, and Israel kept taking part of that land to build what they called moshavim, like settlements inside Israel for immigrants that they pulled over from abroad in order to increase the number of Jews inside the country. When I was younger, because I was born in the United States, I mean, my parents, years ago, and I won't say how many so as to not let you know how old I am, but many years ago, my parents left when my mother was 8 months pregnant with me because they wanted to raise or to start their family in the United States where they wouldn't live under occupation in Beit Zahur, which is where my mom is from. It's a West Bank town near Bethlehem, or live as a discriminated against minority inside Israel. And so I was born and raised here. But as Delinda said, because my father is an Israeli citizen, he was able to give me citizenship, and therefore I am also an Israeli citizen. Now, when I was younger, we could go back and forth, and my father tried to take us all the time, almost every summer, so we can maintain a connection with our land and with our family there. In 1986, that was the last time we went as a family. Because by that time, I was old enough to be cognizant of the discrimination that we were treated with, the humiliation that we were forced to endure as we were separated and strip searched. Even us children, we were traveling. I was the oldest of 4 kids at that time, and even us young kids were strip searched. We were held for so long that the plane took off without us. This is where we were searched actually in Amsterdam on the way to Israel. Israeli security was in Amsterdam on the way to Israel. And the same thing leaving. And so my father decided that he wasn't going to go back again with us as a family. And in 2000, his siblings were telling him that, you know, your father's getting sick and he's dying. You should come see him. And he wouldn't go. And the next time that he went was to attend his father's funeral. And I think that that's a mild case because things are so much worse in many other instances where families are completely separated from each other, where Jews anywhere have a right to come and get almost automatic citizenship in Israel, but Palestinians who were made to refugees cannot be reunited with their families that remained and that are now citizens of Israel. Many of you know about the citizenship and nationality law that was passed in 2003. So a Palestinian citizen who marries a Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza cannot bring that spouse to live with him or her inside Israel. And therefore, you have also dividing families. You cannot bring that, also citizen of Israel cannot bring his or her kids if they're over a certain age to live with him or her inside Israel. Again, tearing families apart. Little things like my sister decided in 2000, she married a Palestinian from our village, and she decided she wanted to live there. And she was going to bring her stuff over. She shipped her car from the United States. And there is a law on the books that the Israelis allow for citizens returning. They allow all these exemptions and all these perks because they want mainly Jews to come back. So she was supposed to be exempted according to this law from having to pay a tax on her car. Her car was worth $12,000. They wanted to charge her $17,000 tax on the car. But she said, look, here's the, I'm qualified for this exemption. I'm a citizen who is returning to the country. And for over a month, office to office, lawyer after lawyer, as her car is being held. And in the end, someone told her, but this doesn't apply to you because you're not Jewish. So the laws on the books don't actually, there are about 50 laws right now that discriminate against the Palestinian citizens of Israel, but they don't actually say that they discriminate against the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It is just how it is applied. It's generally couched in, again, more generic terms. For example, there are over 700 community councils that get to decide what people come and live in their communities. And this is a de facto green light for these councils to say that Palestinians, Christians, and Muslims do not fit the bill to live in our community. But it doesn't say that, that this is what these councils are for, but that's what they are for. I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to, one thing also I wanted to mention is when some of us, I said at the beginning that we became more cognizant of the fact that we are connected to our Palestinian brothers and sisters in the West Bank and Gaza. We are one people, and it is only by Israel's systematic policies that try to paint us as another and divide us, not only physically, but also psychologically. Those of us that have been trying to break that have been targeted in various ways. And the Knesset, the Israeli political body, considering over and over again specific laws that would label citizens as terrorist supporters or terrorists as a way to strip them of citizenship or persecute them, or worse, we have in exile also a prominent political leader, Azmi Bishara, who the Israelis went after as possibly being a traitor. Amir Mahfouz, who is sitting in jail. Also, he was the Palestinian political leader from inside Israel for the same reason. And myself, I've been active mainly in the West Bank and Gaza for a long time. But when we were considering those first boats to Gaza, although I very much wanted to be on them, it was a decision that was not easy to make, because would Israel then paint me as a terrorist supporter because I was going to be on my way to Gaza? But I ended up being on that boat, and we got our boats into Gaza. And when I got a few seconds to speak to the Gaza people, the thousands and thousands that came to welcome us, what did I say? I said that I'm a Palestinian born in the United States. My mother is from the West Bank. My father's from inside Israel. I live in Ramallah. I work in Jerusalem. And I've come home to Gaza. Because we are one people that will not be divided. And I have my daughter here with me. Well, because my husband's busy with my son, but also because I wanted to tell you briefly about their situation, they are also citizens of Israel. Now, I could not pass my citizenship on to them unless they were born in Israel. Again, this is another law that is not specifically meant to, it doesn't say it discriminates against Palestinians specifically, but when applied, yes, if I had my son or my daughter here, I could not pass my Israeli citizenship on to them. And an Israeli Jew might not be able to either, but an Israeli Jew can always go and claim automatic citizenship to Israel. My kids would not be able to. So if I had them here, surrounded by my family and my husband, who was not allowed to be with me because Israel bans him from entering, if I had them here, then in the future Israel could say that they cannot come in and they cannot know their land or their family. So my husband and I made that decision a couple years ago that I would, well, we traveled together actually, and he was arrested. Here's my husband. He was, whew. He was arrested by the Israeli authorities. He sat in jail. We tried to challenge it, but in the end it didn't work, and I was 9 months pregnant. They deported him, and he only got to see his son the first few weeks via Skype. Same thing with our daughter Mayar. But we guaranteed that they at least now have this Israeli citizenship so that in the future, hopefully, Israel will not be able to deny them access to their homeland. To the question whether the Israeli lobby is good for Israel, I think I agree with Gidon Levy in the sense that if we're talking about an Israel, or whatever you want to call it, really, but if we're talking about the well-being of a society, the future of kids in that society, to be able to live free, not discriminated against, and to thrive in that fashion, then what the Israeli lobby is doing is completely antithetical to that. And I don't want my kids to grow up, even though they can have access to the country, but feeling as a discriminated against minority, or even worse. And so I'm working here, hopefully, with all of you, and why this conference is so important is that we build the alternative lobby. Yes, we hear about how powerful AIPAC is, but that's only because we have not yet stepped up to the plate. Because look at all of us, and we are here today, and so many more that aren't here today that think the way we do, that place, Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to call it, should not be a place of racism and discrimination and apartheid and killing. It needs to be something better for all of the kids of that region, no matter what race, religion, or ethnicity. And to do that, we raise our voices. So if the Israeli lobby is going to continue doing what it's doing, then we raise our voices even louder. We join the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. That is putting pressure on Israel, and I think the stranglehold that the Israeli lobby has on the United States is breaking. And I bring my kids to these conferences in the hopes that in the future I can just show them a picture, because what we are fighting for, the reality that we live today, won't be a reality when they're old enough to understand.
Well, we have a lot of questions, and I've put piles in front of each speaker. And I must say, when I first heard Huwaida speak, maybe a decade or two ago, and I don't want to age you, but I said, you are the next Hanana Shrawi. But I never saw Hanana Shrawi give a speech with a baby on her hip. I am very impressed. So would you like to start with your questions? Okay, great.
Is this on? Oh, it is on. Okay. All right, well, it seems that I'm a minority voice here on this panel, which is not always a bad thing. But I think that the reason I think that AIPAC is good for Israel is because I think that Israel could not have gotten away with being Israel. There could not have been this brutal apartheid regime in Palestine had it not been for AIPAC. And the brutal apartheid regime is what Israel is. There is no other form of Israel. There is no possibility for any other type of an Israel. And this kind of leads into the first question here that I have, a comment regarding something that, well, I guess two questions are pretty much complementary. This is regarding to a comment that my father made in a speech here in San Francisco in 1992 when he was still alive, saying, very similar to what Gideon was saying, that AIPAC, or the American blind support and financial aid to Israel, is corrupting Israel because free money corrupts. But I don't think that that is what corrupted Israel. Israel was corrupt from the beginning. Israel was created as a result of a brutal ethnic cleansing and established itself as an apartheid regime immediately when it was formed. There was no better Israel. There was no uncorrupt Israel. There cannot be an uncorrupt Israel because it was built on a crime and it has no legitimacy. So the possibility that something else corrupted it and that perhaps it could have been better without this, I don't think that's a possibility. And AIPAC is the enabler, absolutely. AIPAC is the enabler, or maybe one of the enablers. But I don't think that the financial support is what corrupts. It feeds the corruption, but it was built on, like I said, a crime of terrible crime of ethnic cleansing and brutality, which goes on to this day, perhaps even worse than it was. And then the second question, I'll just kind of connect, so I'll connect the two, which is this whole idea that we could have an Israel next to a Palestinian state living in peace. You cannot have an Israel next to a Palestinian state because Israel is a racist colonialist state that is built on a racist colonialist ideology which cannot be reined in. There cannot be an Israel and a reality where there is some other, rights for Palestinians within it. There could only be a state that affords rights to all of its citizens, regardless of whether they're Israeli or Palestinian, or an Israel which is a racist regime. These are the two options. An option where we have two states, one a Palestinian, one Israeli, is impossible. It's science fiction because you cannot rein in a racist colonialist regime. That's why it hasn't happened, to this day. So that kind of ties in, I think, with both of these questions tied in, and that's why a single democracy or a transforming of Israel from what it is today, the so-called Jewish state, into a democracy with equal rights is really the only solution if we're seeking justice and peace, and if we want Hawaida and her children to have the same rights as my children, who were also born here in the United States and have completely different status when we go to visit Palestine. So that's it. Thank you.
Can I get 1 hour because I have here?
Yeah, that's a problem.
I will not be able to answer all the questions. I'll be happy to answer them privately later because this will really take so long. Let's call it from now on the United States of Israel. Because many times when someone looks at the relations between Israel and the United States, one might ask, who is really the superpower between the two? And those questions become much more valid in the recent days when you see what's going on with Iran. And really, I'm not in a position to tell Americans what to feel, but would I be an American? Like I asked Ehud Barak, would you be a Palestinian? Would I be an American? I would really be embarrassed. When you see a title in Haaretz, in my newspaper, which says 2 days ago, Israel to pressure Congress to thwart Iranian nuclear deal. And then an Israeli official says, Haaretz, that Israel will lobby the US Congress to pass legislation that would make it difficult or even impossible to approve comprehensive deal with Iran. Can you imagine yourself if it would be the opposite? If someone would have written that the Americans are trying to act in the Israeli parliament to change its decisions? I mean, we are dealing now really with almost questions of sovereignty. We are dealing with, really, needless to say, that no state in the world would have dared to do it, and no statesman in the world. And I must tell you frankly, it's not Israel's fault. Israel is doing whatever it can. It's the one who enables it. Now, there were some questions about Haaretz and about myself. This is always easier to answer. Haaretz lost like 1 million shekels, which is around $300,000, only for my article about the pilots in terms of canceling subscribers. And still, Haaretz supports me, and I gain full freedom. And Haaretz found a way to survive even in those bad days. And we have now paywalls, as part of you know, and it's a great success story relatively. And we are struggling like any printed newspaper in the world except of India. In all other parts of the world, the printed newspapers are struggling, but for the short coming time, as far as I know, we will be there. If the Israelis will want it or not, we will be there, and I'll be there as much as I can. Why was Netanyahu re-elected? How come that Netanyahu was re-elected? The $1 million question. That exactly shows what I try to say, where Israel is going. But Netanyahu is an artist of spreading fears. He reminds me of this child in the Charlie Chaplin movie who went and threw stones at windows of shops, and then came his father to fix those windows. So Netanyahu throws the stones, and then he calls his father, which is himself, to fix it. He spread all those fears, not only Iran, not only that all the Palestinians want just one thing, to throw us to the ocean. Even swine flu can become an existential threat in Israel for a few days. He spread all those fears, and then he presented himself as the one and only one who can save Israel from those terrible threats. It's a very well-known method to survive politically. This man never suggested one single hope for Israel. One single hope. There are politicians who build their career on hopes, many times false hopes. He went in a different way. I was last week in Canada. There is a twin to Netanyahu in Canada. Mr. Harper also, you know, I thought when I was in Canada, I felt so much at home. I mean, they have this obsession now with ISIS that in a certain stage I told my partner, let's not go out from the hotel because they are everywhere here. And Harper is elected again and again, and I never met a Harper supporter, I never met a Netanyahu supporter, but by the end of the day, they are re-elected, and that's the secret, I guess. I'll try one more question. What pressure you face to stop you from your writing? This must be very clear. I mean, I get a lot of hate mails. I'm really not the story. But until now, at least, I gain freedom in terms of my newspaper, and also, one must say, in terms of the government. It is not to be taken for granted. In the last war in Gaza, there was one very serious politician from the Likud party who called to bring me to court for treason. Treason in war, by the way, in Israel, might be death penalty, which was never implemented, obviously. But those voices become stronger and stronger. But until now, the only pressure I really face is those unpleasant things from the street, from the Jewish community. The other day, someone wrote me, thank you for a wonderful article, Adolf Hitler, and things like this. Very tasteful. I passed long time ago the wishes for my death. Now it's cancer to my children. And these kind of things, it's not very pleasant, but it's really not the issue. The issue is, where does this place go to Israeli society? You know, the best thing when we try to confront those right-wingers, those Zionists, those mainstream in Israel, the best thing is not to argue with them. The best thing is only to ask, where do you go to? What is your plan? There are no Palestinians, nothing. It's only Israel, chosen people, everything. Where do you direct? What will be in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time? You really believe that this will be possible forever? And there will be no answer. And my last remark, what you just mentioned, Miko, we can do a whole lecture out of it. Me, like you, I truly believe that the two-state solution is dead. I think that this train left the station. I deeply regret it, but it left the station. I think that all those who speak now about the two-state solution do so deliberately, only to gain more time in order to base the occupation even deeper and deeper. Thank you.
Okay, I had a comment, or a couple of comments, and it's very true. This one says, please, when talking about Arab Palestinians, please include Druze too. It's not only Muslims and Christians. And that is very true. When I said Christians and Muslims, I did not mean to exclude Druze, very much Druze, Bedouins, all Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. And there's another question along that line that said, in regards to Arab, well, this one says Arab Israeli citizens or Palestinian citizens of Israel, would a Druze experience the same discrimination? Does the Israeli government discriminate among the Arabs living inside Israel, such as Druze, Christians, and Muslims, or are they treated equally? I don't have any hard facts about this or statistics. It show, for the most part, they're treated they're treated equally. They're not Jewish. Of course, the Druze community, as most probably know, serve in the Israeli military. And so therefore, they are eligible for some perks that come along with serving in the Israeli military that those that don't serve in the Israeli military aren't eligible for. But also within the Druze community, it's not 100%. It is split probably around 50-50 in terms of those who serve and those that don't. It's an internal debate within the Druze community. And I know I have a relative who is Druze who refused to serve in the Israeli military. He was going to be a doctor, and he was thrown in jail. He served his time in jail and could not later pursue that. He could not become a doctor because of the fact that he feigned some kind of insanity to get, not necessarily insanity, but some reason why he could not serve in the Israeli military. But he was allowed to become a politician, and he is currently a politician. So there is, that special circumstances of the Druze actually having to serve in the military because of an agreement that their religious leader made with the State of Israel when the State of Israel was founded. But many, many Druze refused to serve. As far as, I think also, although this is unsubstantiated, it's not backed by any kind of empirical evidence, but I think that it is a little bit harder for Israel to do some of the things to the Christian community that it sometimes can get away with doing to the Muslim community because Israel tries to paint itself, as a victim mainly of Islam and Muslims, and to paint Islam as the, kind of global enemy, and Israel being a safe haven for Christians. So if you hear about, Christian homes being demolished en masse, that wouldn't look too good for Israel. And so in terms of maintaining that kind of public perception that it wants to maintain to keep itself as the victim, I think the level of discrimination when it comes to a lot of outright things are the same. Like I talked about the communities that can decide who lives and who doesn't live within certain communities, and this discriminates against all non-Jews. Since the founding of the State of Israel, Israel has established over 600 communities and municipalities Jewish, not one for any Palestinians, Christian, Muslims, or Druze, or otherwise, none. This kind of discrimination is the same. But when you talk about the Bedouins and Israel moving and having a plan to move large-scale numbers of Bedouins out of their communities, or to demolish homes, not only in the Negev, but also in Lid, these are mainly Bedouins, Muslims, And so I think that there's that little bit of a distinction there. Sorry, I went on for too long with that question. There's, do you read Haaretz? What is its reputation inside Israel? I do sometimes read Haaretz, not religiously, but its reputation inside Israel, it's the left-wing newspaper. It's the Zionist left newspaper. I think Gidon talked a little bit about how they lost some followers, but it is seen as the very lefty. It's not the mainstream newspaper. And so take that as you will. And I think the last one that I have time for is, can you describe what needs to be done to raise the massacre at Deir Yassin, April 9th, 1948? So yesterday we did just commemorate the massacre of Deir Yassin. And I'm not sure what the question is as to raise up, but if it is to make it more well-known, I think that one of the things that we need to do is to document and commemorate. These massacres are ongoing. After Deir Yassin, just last summer and before, we're talking Gaza, and I fear there probably will be more. But we need to do what I think we're doing right now, documenting, so very important, not forgetting, continuing to commemorate, and joining also political action to make a change. So another plug for something that every one of us can do in our own communities, and that is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, because that is having a tangible effect on Israel, that is scaring the bleep out of Israel, in that it is mobilizing its forces to fight that, because Israel's afraid of delegitimization. And the only reason they can continue doing what it's doing is because it spends so much trying to legitimize their actions. And when we work to turn Israel into that pariah state that it is, until it dismantles its colonial apartheid system, that is what we all need to do. And it's so, you don't have to go over to Palestine, you don't have to get on a boat to Gaza, you do it with your own community, your own union, your own home. And that is giving me hope for change. And so for Deir Yassin, for all the other massacres that have happened, and I fear might be, we will not forget. And I truly believe that these victims will get justice one day.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're running a little late, but you wanted to say one more thing?
One final remark, really final. Many times people tell me, look, the United States is like an aircraft carrier. It takes time to move its directions, and you must be less impatient because historical changes take time, and you should look at it in terms of history, of decades, of generations. And I must remind all of us that by the end of the day, we are dealing with the third generation under the occupation, with the fourth or fifth generation ever since the State of Israel was established. Those people deserve also something. Those people deserve dignity and freedom, and they don't have time to wait until this aircraft carrier will change its direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our panelists are wonderful. Thank you so much. And we'll have the next panel come and